Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session presented by Human 37. The topic of today will be 5 tips to help you successfully use behavioral data. Maybe a quick word of introduction about myself and about our company. My name is Clement Merlinde. I am the co-founder and lead solution architect at Human 37. We are what we call a customer data strategy agency, and our mission is to build a world where customers get the best experiences of brands. That means that we are helping brands to understand who their customers are, what they should do with the data they have about their customers, and how they can transform that into the best experiences for their customers. What is our objective, or my objective at least, for today's session? And I hope that that kind of sets the scene for what you can expect. I would like to share some of the experience that we have with regards to behavioral analytics and how it can drive business growth. I'll come back to the concept of behavioral data and behavioral analytics as such, so you don't need to worry. We also want to share that the fact that everybody has data, but very few companies are able to actually do something valuable with it. And that's something we would like to change as a company. Because we believe that customer data holds a lot of insights on how customer experiences could and should be. And that's why we're sharing these tips today. And we also want to share you from a strategic and an operational level how data activation can be stimulated. Now, I already mentioned the main keyword in the previous section or previous slide when I said behavioral data. Now, the first question for a lot of people in the room will probably be, what is behavioral data? Well, Wikipedia, let's call it like that, defines it as behavioral analytics is a recent advancement in business analytics that reveals new insights into behavior of customers on e-commerce platforms, online games, web and mobile applications, and the Internet of Things. The way we like to define it is event-based analytics. Well, probably a lot of people or brands in the room today are using it without actually using it or actually knowing what it means. Let me rephrase it like that way. Event-based analytics is basically the new way things are being measured. And when I say measuring, you might actually know that under the concept of interactions. Event-based measurement is measuring interactions in a new data schema, which is called event-based measurement, which is composed of a number of events and a number of properties that contextualize everything that's going on. You might be familiar with these things without actually knowing that these are called event-based analytics products, objects, measurement schemas, because some of you might be using, for instance, in your company, Mixpanel, Amplitude, or even Google Analytics. The newest version, Google Analytics 4, is using an event-based measurement schema. So it might sound scary or daunting, but I can assure you, once you understand the concept of it, it's fully manageable. I mentioned that I was going to share 5 tips in order to help you leverage behavioral data for your company and drive success from there. My first tip is behavioral data needs to be part of a process. I already mentioned before, a lot of companies have data, but very few companies succeed in building better experiences using them. Which is kind of weird or kind of not what you would expect, for the simple reason that everybody agrees that we live in an experience-driven economy, right? You look at companies such as Bol.com, Zalando, Amazon, even HelloFresh, or any other of these companies, and you know that because they drive the best customer experiences and they drive delight for their customers, they are able to facilitate business growth. Now, everybody understands this, everybody agrees on this concept, but the reality is actually more complex than this. It's not as simple as we create an excellent customer experience and business will grow. It actually means that you need to have a process in place that facilitates customer experience and delight, and as a result, you will get business growth. Let me come back to that. Why? Because the whole concept of today that we're bringing is behavioral data, event-based measurement schemas, and the way it can drive business growth. It immediately means that you're seeing the red box as the start and the business growth as the result. It also means that it's not as simple as in my previous slide, because those are only the 2 last steps. Everything starts with having proper and granular data collection on how users are or customers are interacting with your brand, regardless of the interface. It could be on the web, it could be on the apps that you provide, it could be through emailing campaigns, it could be through advertising campaigns. These days, everything is measurable. That doesn't mean you need to measure deliberately. And so the data collection layer is very important. You need to have this data-driven concept in mind. The next step is actually to turn data into insights. There's a lot of companies, let's say all companies, who are collecting data. Very few companies are able to turn it into insights. And even fewer companies, let's say almost none of them, are actually able to drive customer experiences and delight based on the data collection that they have gathered in the first place. Which is kind of weird, because that's the whole concept of why we gather data, right? It's important to keep this loop in mind and to actually ensure that the different people, the different roles, the different stakeholders and units in your organization are able to fulfill this concept, or able to fulfill this flywheel, where all the decisions are taken to some degree on data that is being collected on how customers are actually using your products, on how they're interacting with the interactions that you provide them. So it starts with data collection, then moving into an insight, and from that insight, actually using that insight in order to drive a better variation of the product. I already mentioned it. Driving better experiences can be a lot of things. It can be building better websites for product managers, better applications for product managers. For marketers, it could mean driving better campaigns. Think of, in the context of Actito, you have an interaction, which is actually an event. And based on that, you have an idea of users or customers, are they interacting to that type of message correctly? Or as I anticipated, yes or no? And what is the action I can take from there and iterate upon that? It's the same concept, but on a way wider scheme. And then you have other elements, such as for very product-oriented companies, such as onboarding flows. The objective is actually to always start by capturing data, looking for an insight in that data, and then fulfilling that into, or transforming that into, a better iteration of the product you already had. Because if you build great products, build great experience, and bring delight to customers, your business will de facto grow. That's the first element. Number two is build a democratic data architecture, or data structure, more specifically. I already mentioned event-based measurements. For the people who are a bit in analytics, this is kind of more of a geeky topic, which is kind of my cup of tea as well. But a lot of companies we work with, they say, okay, we are collecting data and we have all of these tools. This is a screenshot from Mixpanel, but it could be any type of data collection layer. It could be GA4, it could be Mixpanel, it could be Amplitude, it could be a CDP, it could even be a data warehouse. It's not because the data is there that it's actually useful or easy to consult. Let me explain you a bit, or elaborate a bit on that concept. We call it not all data is equal. And this is actually a screenshot from an implementation that we have revised from one of our clients. And on the right-hand side, you see what looks, or what seems to be, a very complex query, right? You have up to A, B, C, D, E, F number of events that have been composed, each of with specific properties. So it looks like this person who compiled these queries is actually looking into doing some very deep analysis. I hate to disappoint you, because that's absolutely not the case. What you're seeing here on the left screenshot is basically somebody trying to figure out how many people registered. And on the right-hand side, that same person trying to figure out which source mediums were connected to the user who registered. It looks like it's very complex, right? And the reason for that is that the data structure, the data capturing structure, was not optimized. It means that we are dealing with suboptimal tracking, which creates problematic data ingestion, which creates, in return, as you can tell, nightmare analysis, which in the beginning people will do, but in the end they will stop doing, which in the end results in no analysis and failure, because you never go from that data collection layer to actually the insights, which is actually the prerequisite you need in order to build better experiences. Now, I'm going to show you how we optimize this specific thing, and what I mean between an optimal and a suboptimal plan, and what it means to have democratic information as a result. Now, this is an example of an event-based measurement schema. And this is a concept that we call a tracking plan. You don't need to remember that. It's just an FYI, because somewhere you might encounter it if you're talking about event-based measurement. But these are about 19 to 20 events. And this is for a SaaS company doing a freemium subscription. And each time you want to use one of their premium features, you get a paywall. This is why the events are called compile timeout paywall click or compile timeout paywall prompt. A paywall click is essentially somebody who clicks on the paywall, and a paywall prompt, you could compare it to an impression. Now, if I would ask somebody or an analyst to give me an idea of how many times did somebody click a paywall or prompt a paywall, they need to understand all of these events and they need to sum them correctly. You already see that it's quite a challenge. You need to be understanding which events exist. You can't forget any of these events, because otherwise your analysis is falsified and incomplete. So what we did is we actually reworked this data schema. What happened is that we split it out. I already mentioned that we had the click and the prompt, or the impression. And so what you see is you can split this nicely out under a click and under a paywall, under a prompt, sorry. Now, what we did next is we created in this event-based measurement schema that you will encounter in Amplitude, Mixpanel, GA4, or even in a raw form sent to your database, because this is where the world is moving towards, event-based measurement. You can see that we create an event called paywall click and an event called paywall prompt. And underneath that, we just have one property, which is called the paywall type. Now, on the right-hand side in the purple box is the optimized version of this mini tracking plan, while on the left-hand side, you see the original suboptimal version of this tracking plan. You could ask, like, okay, Glenn, but what's the difference? I don't see the difference. Remember that flywheel we had in mind where we said everything starts with data collection, but you need to get to the insight generation. Well, basically, who generates insights? It's typically not the people who implement the data collection layer, right? It's other people, it's marketeers, it's product owners, it's analysts. And they don't deal well, typically, with complex data structures. So we try to simplify it for them. The product that they are using in this context is Mixpanel. And so on the left-hand side, you see the original query. You see how complex it is? You, again, have 6 events, each with properties trying to compose the whole thing with the original data schema or tracking plan underneath it. And on the right-hand side, you can see the revised query. And you can see how easy it is for people to surface insights. We have one event and we break it down by one property. And so the result that you see on the left-hand side and the right-hand side is exactly the same. However, the way to getting there on the right-hand side is way easier. It also means that onboarding people is easier and that your chances to scale insights, because a lot of people can consult that data, is being increased. The result of that is something that we call data democratization, and it allows people to actually understand what is going on. In an event-based measurement schema or behavioral data, you basically have an event and a number of properties that are linked to this. We have something called an analyst matrix that we foresee, which is basically helping people to understand for each event which properties are linked to that and how can I break down events. This can only be done in an optimal tracking scheme. My third tip is, because some of you might find this very, very technical already, but my number 3 tip is always document and always provide minimal viable documentation. Why is documentation important? You don't want to have an organization where you have one guy acting as a one-bus team. A one-bus team is basically some guy or one person who is capable of doing one specific task. However, if he or she runs under a bus, that whole operation is problematic for the rest of the team to continue and could even endanger your organization. The number 1 element to counter that is basically document. I'm a huge fan of documentation. I drive my colleagues and sometimes my clients nuts. It doesn't mean that I document extensively. I use a concept called minimal viable documentation, just like you would do in startups where you say minimal viable product or prototype. And it means that I just create enough documentation for other people to understand what's going on without having to rewrite an entire Bible every time some feature changes. But I want to highlight a couple of reasons why documentation, especially in the world of behavioral data and especially analytics in general, is important, right? It allows for self-onboarding. In the previous element or in the previous step, you saw that data democratization or tracking plans need to be optimal. It can still be very hard to understand what's going on. You don't want to be dependent on an expert to explain you which data is available for you to be analyzed. So you want to create some piece of documentation, something very democratic, something that is self-explanatory for everybody. It will facilitate your life. It will help to onboard people. It will help people onboard independently. And it also ensures that time, money, and effort, resources can be spent on making progress rather than constantly trying to figure out what you implemented 6 months, 3 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months ago. So it also ensures that your focus can go towards the future and construction rather than going to the past and reconstruction. And it simply makes your data scalable. It allows to go from data collection to insights very fast because you have more people that can get onboarded and that can drive insights at scale. Now, in the past, I don't know how many of you have been in the industry for how long, but in the past, like usual suspects in terms of documentation platforms would be SharePoint or any other open text, for instance, platform, which would be very heavy for an organization to use. Not super fun either, if I can be very honest. But in the latest years or in the last few years, with the increase of SaaS products and platforms, there's been a lot of very good documentation platforms out there, or platforms that are not necessarily used for documentation or designed for documentation, but can be used as such because they're very lightweight, very intuitive, and very fun to use as well, which helps to maintain documentation. Examples that we use at Human 37 are Confluence, Notion, Slab, Coda, but there could be others. And the screenshot is actually an example of how we document product analytics for one of our. Tip 4 is make data accessible beyond marketing. If we dive into research, and this is very, very recent research, I think it was released at the time of this recording, right, a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and it's a collaboration between Digiday and Piano. And basically, they asked for a couple of organizations. They provide the survey, and again, in the survey, alongside many other surveys, it shows that the marketing team today is responsible for analytics outcomes. Not only for outcomes, but they also typically own the tool stack, because web analytics, behavioral analytics is simply seen as something that is linked to marketing. Now, what we believe is that marketing should be one of the owners, or let's say should be one of the consumers of that data. But analytics should actually be consumed by way more teams, especially when you are talking about behavioral analytics. Behavioral analytics, because of the event-based measurement model, allows for very granular measurements. It means that we can measure very specific actions and provide a lot of context. It means that we can track if somebody clicks a specific button, where that button was placed, which color it had, what time of the day it was, what profile that user had, in which section of the page it was, etc., etc. So all of these properties around the event can provide a lot of context. And we believe that the future of behavioral analytics and analytics as a whole is that there's not one set of data or multiple sets of data that's being consumed by one type of persona, but there's actually one set of data, a handful of roles, and hundreds of use cases that can be deployed. I've written down some examples that we've actually worked on with some of our clients, and we define these as user stories, but it's just to show you that different roles and different area of focus can actually consume data from that source. An example is, as a marketer, I would like to know which features contribute to most to conversion, so I can create landing pages for my campaign that include this feature. I also have product owners looking at behavioral data to understand which filters are being used in their product section and how specific filters are being used more than others and how that can change in the next iteration of the product. I also work with teams of data scientists where they use behavioral data because they're interested in the click stream and understand which type of behavior contributes to a higher likelihood of conversion rather than another. So you see that there's a bunch of possibilities based on one set of behavioral data, and that it should not only be owned by marketing, but it should basically be democratized. This can only be democratized, obviously, if your documentation is in place, if your process is in place, and if your data tracking schema is optimized. The fifth and last tip is data is worthless if it's not activated. And I want to come back to the original flywheel that we discussed. Like I said, almost all companies collect data. Few companies are able to generate insights, and almost no companies are able to deliver customer experiences and delight because they don't activate the data. Why? Typically because organizations don't have the culture in order to foster this, because the use cases are often more complex than they should be, and the low-hanging fruit is not being reached. But activating data can be very simple. It can go to, it can range from better website design, better app design, better campaign flows, better onboarding flows. And I have a couple of examples with me of what activated data looks like. And I see that one of my images, voila, is not loading. It can be better campaigns, and this is a well-known example in the industry where Carlos is just using that data from users in order to personalize advertising and bring better experiences rather than a generic one-to-many conversation or remarketing banner. They bring this one-to-one banner infused by data. It's a better experience in the campaigning field. This is another example of one of our clients where we're working on optimizing the filters. As a product owner, I'm interested to understand which type of customers, based on their previous behavior, interact with which type of filters. Meaning that maybe half of these filters for this person are not relevant, so we can reduce them. Maybe 20% of these filters are not relevant for any of the users, so we can just cut them down in the next product iteration. And then last but not least, you want to go to the ultimate personal experience, right? Where the data that you as a customer is being used in order to bring relevant experiences to you. This is an actual screenshot that I have from Zalando, where I was looking for a shirt. They have thousands of shirts, and basically what they said is, when I was scrolling through it and about to put this in my basket, they said, look, you bought this in size medium a year ago and you returned it. This is a very smart way of using my data, because in the end, I did not buy this shirt because they already knew that I bought it. I forgot it, but they knew it. And so they prevented it from being packaged, being shipped, me waiting for the package, hoping that it would be what I needed, getting disappointed afterwards, saying that, damn, it's a second shirt at Blender that I buy and it is not my fit, and send it back. So everybody would be disappointed, we would lose time and resources. And so basically they use this data in order to drive a very personalized experience for me. Now, I hope that these 5 tips actually inspire you to do something, to explore the possibilities of behavioral analytics as a whole, and making data-driven decisions, to start collecting data, to go dig for insights, but most of all, please, the data you have, dig into it and look for activation possibilities. Thank you very much. And if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them.